One live street lamp lit 5 dead ones, 2 with broken globes. Climbing a 10-foot tilted asphalt slab that jerked once under him, rumbling like a live thing, he saw pebbles roll off the edge, heard them clink on fugitive plumbing, then splash somewhere in darkness. No lights in any near building, but down those waterfront streets beyond the veils of smoke, was that fire? Already used to the smell, he had to breathe deeply to notice it. The sky was all haze. Buildings jabbed up into it and disappeared. Light? At the corner of a 4-foot alley, he spent 10 minutes exploring just because the lamp worked. Across the street, he could make out concrete steps, a loading porch under an awning, doors. A truck had overturned at the block's end. Nearer, 3 cars, windows rimmed with smashed glass, squatted on skewed hubs, like frogs gone marvelously blind.
Dahlgren was a very ambitious project for me. It took me about 5 or maybe even more than 5 years to write. And it has lots and lots of different rhetorical modes are used in Dahlgren. One of the ones that I like is there are a number of newspaper articles in it, and they're some of my favorite parts, and this is one of the newspaper articles. Under the date July 17th, 1969 was the headline, "Mysterious Rumors, Mysterious Lights." Would your editor ever like some pictures with this one? We, unfortunately, were asleep. But from what we can gather, shortly after midnight last night, so far 26 versions of the story have come in, with contradictions enough to oblige our registering an official editorial doubt. The fog and smoke blanketing Bologna these last months were torn by a wind at too great an altitude to feel at street level. Parts of the sky were cleared and the full or near full moon was allegedly visible, as well as a crescent moon only slightly smaller or slightly larger than the first. The excited versions from which we have culled our own report contain many discrepancies. Here are some. The full orb was the usual moon, the crescent was the intruder. The crescent was the real moon, the full the impostor. A young student says that, in the few minutes these downright Elizabethan portents were revealed, he made out markings on the full disk that prove it was definitely not our moon. 2 hours later, someone came into the office, the only person so far who claims to have caught any of this phenomenon through an admittedly low-powered telescope, to assure us that the full disk definitely was the moon, while the crescent was bogus. In the 6 hours since the occurrence, as we write into the dawn, explanations offered the times have ranged from things so science fiction-y we do not pretend to understand their arcane machinery, down to the all-purpose heat lightning and weather balloon perennial explanation of the UFO. I pass on, as typical, one comment from our own Professor Wellman, who was observing from the July gardens with several other guests. One we all agreed was nearly full, the other was definitely crescent. I pointed out to the Colonel, Mrs. Green, and Roxanne, and Toby, who were with me, that the crescent, which was lower in the sky, was convexed away from the bright area of the higher moon. Moons do not light themselves. Their illumination comes from the sun. Even with 2 moons, the sun can only be in one direction from them both, no matter which phases they are in. If they are both visible in the same quarter of the sky, both should be lighted on the same side, which was not the case here. To which your editor can only say that any agreement, certainty, or definiteness about these moons are cast into serious doubt, unless we are prepared to make even more preposterous speculations about the rest of the cosmos. No, we did not see it. Which leaves us finally in this editorial position. We are sure something happened in the sky last night, but to venture what it was would be absurd. Brand new moons do not appear. In the face of the night's hysteria, we should like to point out quietly that whatever happened is explicable. Things are, though this, admittedly, is no guarantee we shall ever have the explication. From Dhalgren, the last chapter, the Anathemata. Gladys and Mike, sleeping, knee to knee, forehead to forehead, his hair long and light,
lies over hers, tight and black, his arm over her brown collar, her arm above her belly. She snores, conceit. They curled, facing like single quote marks enclosing an ellipsis paired to a unit point. Dhalgren, from the Anathemata. Life in the Behavioral Sink, episode 16,637. Heavy Cathedral, who is getting heavier, squatted last evening with his back to the house, discussing the behavior of overcrowded rats, with a half dozen of us who stood around listening. Gladys had just come by, cradling a poor dead mouse that had to be flushed down the toilet. Sure, counters astute, diminutive, and dark angel, who is drunk. The similarities between rats and people are very large, but the differences, I suspect, are on the order of the factor of the differences in body weight between an undernourished mouse and an 8-month pregnant woman. Is art and sex replacing sex and death as the concerns of the serious mind? Life here would make me think so.
This is a brief passage from Nova, in which two of the characters, both of them, they're my artist characters. One is a guy named Hayden, who is writing a novel 1,000 years from now, in a time when there are no novels anymore. And the other is another artist, a young gypsy boy who's called the Mouse. And the two of them, many light years away, are on the deck of a kind of, I guess you'd call it a boat, but it's sailing over a river that's made of nothing of fog. On the crawler deck, Hayden leaned on the rail, looking through the plastic wall as white waves crackled and uncoiled over the sun to shatter by the hull. "Have you ever thought," Hayden said, as the mouse came up to him, sucking on a piece of rock candy, "what a difficult time a man from the past would have understanding the present? Suppose someone who died in, let's say, the 26th century woke up here. Do you realize how totally horrified and confused he'd just be walking around this crawler?" "Yeah?" The mouse took the candy out of his mouth. "Want to finish this? I'm through with it." "Thanks. Just take the matter of—" Hayden's jaw staggered as his teeth crushed crystalline sugar from the linen thread. "Cleanliness. There was a 1,000-year period from about 1500 to 2500 when people spent an incredible amount of time and energy keeping things clean. It ended when the last communicable disease finally became not only curable, but impossible. There used to be an incredibility called the common cold that even in the 25th century you could be fairly sure of having at least once a year. I suppose back then there was some excuse for the fetish. There seemed to have been some correlation between dirt and disease. But after contagion became an obsolescent concern, sanitation became equally obsolescent. If our man from 500 years ago, however, saw you walking around the deck with one shoe off and one shoe on, then saw you sit down to eat with that same foot, without bothering to wash it, do you have any idea how upset he'd be? No kidding." Here's a section of Nova where Hayden is making a note on his novel, on a little jeweled recorder that he carries around with him that's kind of like a notebook. He says into the recorder, "History? 3,600 years ago, Herodotus and Thucydides invented it. They defined it as the study of whatever had happened during their own lives. And for the next 1,000 years, it was nothing else. 1,600 years after the Greeks in Constantinople, Anna Komnena, in her legalistic brilliance, and in essentially the same language as Herodotus, wrote history as the studies of those events of man's actions that had been documented. I doubt if this charming Byzantine believed things only happened when they were written about, but incidents unchronicled were simply not considered the province of history in Byzantium. The whole concept had transformed. In another 1,000 years, we had reached that century which began with the first global conflict and ended with the first conflict between globes brewing. Somehow, The theory had risen that history was a series of cyclic rises and falls as one civilization overtook another. Events that did not fit on the cycle were defined as historically unimportant.
Night. Night the terrible. Carefully, Sam the spy walked down the steps into the strange cellar. The light behind him dimmed. He glanced back. Someone had just closed the wooden doors up to the street. Moonlit chinks along the ceiling's edge by the ends of the great beams were winking out here and there. Outside, he realized, things were toppling over the small openings. Something shook the whole building. Behind, the cellar doors flapped up a moment, but only dirt and darkness tumbled down the steps before they closed for good under the weight above. Water began running through the single upper window, suddenly to gush, while trickles rilled the walls. The subterranean chamber was descending into the sea. The pressure grew intense. It was becoming harder to breathe. What light there was in the weedy water dimmed as they sank, but in the last of it he realized behind him, beside him, something formless and dark was in there with him. It splashed toward him through the darkening flood. He had to get out, get away. Only in the enclosing blackness his breath was stifled in his chest. Atlantis, the scene on the Brooklyn Bridge with Hart and Sam. Above hung the stone and steel harp, moving in the shadow of your single and twin existence. A third of the way back, waking in intact appreciation of it, Sam stopped to sit on one of the benches and gaze off at the clouds over Brooklyn. Sputum, urine, feces. Before it swells the way a waterfall drums at different levels, at least he should find a policeman and tell him what had happened. He even got up, thinking to start again for the nearer Brooklyn shore, but as he stood he realized the one thing he would never find among those fields and farmhouses was a policeman. Policemen were in cities. Sam sat again, certainly boat, hat, and the man's odd unconcern about his nakedness seemed connected in Sam's mind with the more rural, "Excuse me," someone said behind him, "but you're Negro, aren't you?" Sam turned on the bench to see standing behind him the man he'd bumped when he'd been staring through the planks. "Yes," Sam said, "that's right, I am." "I know it's none of my business," the man said, "but I bet a lot of people meet you and think you're white." "Well, a lot of people up here did. Some of them. The reason I suspected, I suppose, is that I have a colored friend, a writer, a marvelous writer. He writes stories, and they're much more like poems. You read them, and you can just see the sunlight on the fields and hear the sound of the Negro girl's laughter. His name is Gene." "Toomer?" Sam supplied. "Now, don't tell me you're related to him." The man laughed. "Though you look somewhat like him. You know, Gene just ran off with the wife of my good friend Waldo, so I don't think I'm really supposed to like him right through here. It's the kind of thing you don't write your mother about. But I do. Like him, that is. He's handsome, brilliant, talented. How could one help it? Maybe that's why I took a chance and spoke to you, because you do look something like him. New York is the biggest of cities, but the smallest of worlds. Everybody always turns out to know everybody else." From the Motion of Light and Water. Dr. G said, "You know, Chip, change is a very frightening thing." Recalling so many conversations between Marilyn and me in those first months of marriage. "Change," she had written, finally, exhaustedly, in something between despair and resignation, "is neither merciful nor just. And you've been going through nothing but change for the last 3.5 years. Think of a subway. Think of what it does. You're walking through one part of the city, now you suddenly go down steps underground. You can't see anything of the world above. Then, after a loud, racketing ride, you suddenly come upstairs like a swimmer breaking through the surface. You walk out, and everything is completely different, changed. You're in a whole new place. Now you say you've been taking the subway here to the hospital every day. That's very brave, maybe not necessarily so. But the next time you come, as soon as you go down the steps, don't let yourself get lost in where you are.
Forget about being afraid or not being afraid. Instead, I want you to picture where you're going. Try to picture the stop over on Lexington where you come out. Try to see in your mind what the street around that stop looks like. Concentrate on your destination. You smile. Now, tell me how it goes.
It went a whole lot better. The sight of genitals when you don't expect them, in a public space, say, astonishes. The heart pounds, the stomach clutches. This is what makes exposure a violation. But it is not the greatest astonishment in the world, and acclamation mitigates it. For a moment I wondered if, indeed, it was an oversight, and when we are astonished we often laugh, which is healthy if the shock signals no danger. Just then, among the three men at the door, the heavy one in the baseball cap looked up. With a slightly suspended smile, he turned to the others. "Hey, there's your cousin up there," and laughed. Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, page 40. A glib wisdom holds that people like this just don't want relationships. They have problems with intimacy. But the salient fact is, these were relationships. In Tommy's case, in Gary's, and in several others, they were relationships that lasted years. Intimacy for most of us is a condition that endures, however often repeated, for minutes or for hours. And these had their many intimate hours. But, like all sane relationships, they also had limits. Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, page 48. But not all tales end in premature death or incarceration. For most, indeed, we never learn an end at all. Page 56, 57. Despite moments of infatuation on both sides, these were not love relationships. The few hustlers accepted, they were not business relationships. They were encounters whose most important aspect was that mutual pleasure was exchanged, an aspect that, yes, colored all their other aspects, but that did not involve any sort of life commitment. Most were affable, but brief, because beyond pleasure, these were people you had little in common with. Yet what greater field and force than pleasure can human beings share? More than half were single encounters, but some lasted over weeks, others for months, still others went on a couple of years, and enough endured a decade or more to give them their own flavor, form, and characteristic aspects. You learn something about these people, though not necessarily their name or where they lived or what their job or income was, and they learned something about you. The relationships were not necessarily consecutive. They braided, they interwove, they were simultaneous. Several times I saw Gary in the morning and Arlie and or Tommy in the afternoon. These relationships did not annoy or in any way distress the man I was living with because they had their limits. They were not the central relationships of my life. They made that central relationship richer, however, by relieving it of many anxieties. The Middle Passage was, of course, the passage from Africa, from the barracoons, from the place where the slaves were sold by the Arabian slavers to the white slavers, who would then take them to the slave markets of New Orleans and Florida and sell them here. And that boat passage, which was a horrendous crossing, was the Middle Passage. Well, over the last 15 years or so, the idea of the Middle Passage has become just a very important one to black intellectuals at all levels. The poet Robert Hayden wrote an extraordinary poem called Middle Passage,
a couple of years ago when the Norton Anthology of African American Literature came out, I read at the YWCA along with a number of other writers who were reading in honor of the anthology. And lots of people have done things with it. The composer Anthony Davis set parts of Hayden's poem to music, and it's just a very poignant and indescribable event in the history of blacks in the United States. It's one of those events, like the Holocaust, that you can't really describe or represent in art, and yet people have to try and try again. An artist named Feeling did a wonderful collection that's been published in a book of paintings on the Middle Passage. And when I was writing Atlantis Three Tales, and particularly the first story in that, Atlantis Model 1924, I wanted to sort of gesture toward the toward both Hayden's poem and the event itself. When you reduce it to metaphor, you betray the event itself, of course. But at the same time, it's a useful, more than useful. It's a very vibrant metaphor for any kind of transition, the movement, and certainly transitions in Black life. When I first read Hayden's poem, which was fairly recently, I don't think I encountered the poem more than 10 years ago now. I was very impressed with it, and very moved by it. Among the things that are part of that, of course, of the famous case of the Amistad, and Prince Cinque, who led this rebellion on a slave ship. That became the basis for Melville's Benito Cereno, and the images were just moved me a lot, and so there are allusions to it in the novella. It starts with a catalog of the names of boats. Jesus, Estrella, Esperanza, Mercy. Sails flashing to the wind like weapons, sharks following the moans, the fever and the dying, horror the corpuscunt, and compass rose. And the corpuscunt, of course, is the St. Elmo's fire that flickers along the ropes and stays. Middle passage, voyage through death to life upon these shores. And voyage through death to life upon these shores is one of the lines I used as an epigraph to the very first chapter of Atlantis Three Tales. And then immediately, very much in a Crane-like move, although Hayden makes it very much his own, it goes to a kind of piece of documentation. 10 April 1800, blacks rebellious, crew uneasy. Our linguist says their moaning is a prayer for death, ours and their own. Some try to starve themselves, lost 3 this morning, leaped with crazy laughter to the waiting sharks, sang as they went under. Desire, adventure, Tartar, Anne, another catalog of ships' names. And again, standing to America, bringing home black gold, black ivory, black seed. Deep in the festering hole thy father lies, of his bones New England pews are made. Those are altar lights that were his eyes. And of course that's a kind of riff on Shakespeare's full fathom 5 thy father's lies. These are pearls that were his eyes, from the Tempest. And then again it moves on to a kind of Protestant hymn. Jesus, Savior, pilot me over life's tempestuous sea. We pray that thou wilt grant, O Lord, safe passage to our vessels, bringing heathen souls unto thy chastening. And one can hear a Puritan
a Puritan preacher, very much a white Puritan preacher preaching, and then Jesus Savior, the recall of the hymn, and on through the rest of the poem. It's a wonderful poem, and stopping to comment on it kind of destroys the mosaic juxtaposition that makes the pieces really leap up and glitter. It's a hard, it's a hard thing to talk. It's like talking about the Holocaust. Literally hundreds of thousands of people died in this situation when people went blind on the ships. When slaves went blind on the ships, they threw the blind slaves over. Although we don't know exactly what the cause of the ophthalmia was, it eventually, in this particular ship, it also infected the crew. But slaves were just pushed into the water, chained together, in great loads. It's a very, it's one of those intolerable situations that beyond a certain point, can't really be described. You read about it, and everything that you read about is just a sort of fragment that you put together in your own picture. These were people who were chained together and in endless coffles and lying in spaces that were 18 inches high. They were packed together like corpses, like you would pack corpses, between the decks of the ships. And many died, and and when they died, they weren't removed, and you were chained in, with the corpses. And if if everything from your medical resistance to your spirit was strong enough, perhaps you survived. So it was a weeding out process. The people who did survive were among the strongest, and then sold. And then the actual selling process itself was worked over to be totally destructive of any sort of community or any sort of coherent African culture. No two people who came from the same tribe were ever sold together. No two people who could speak the same language were sold together. Anything resembling a family was broken up. If you were caught speaking anything other than English, the few words you might have picked up on the trip across, you were beaten. And you weren't allowed to speak your own languages. And this was enough to really destroy the kinds of cultural solidity that we associate with with any other nationality coming to the country, be it the Italians, the Irish, the Polish, the Jews, the Russians. This is so when the slaves were brought to the country, nothing was allowed to survive, even at the lowest family level. This is the full resonances of this have never really been explored, and I would like to explore some of this in what I'm writing now. It's stuff that doesn't really come into Atlantis, but it's some of the stuff that I'm kind of working on in the novels that I'm working on, currently. Transitions, by definition, are violent. And one of the elements of African American life, for especially the first, 100 or 150 years, was there's a great deal of violence in that life because of the conflict, because of social conflicts. When you have a bunch of people who are basically considered animals, and we were not legally human beings until relatively recently. Animals are treated with a fair amount of violence. They're beaten. They're killed when they're extraneous, and this is the way we were dealt with. so it was, this is what life, there was this element was always there in life, and you find it in the, you find it in the those horrific opening chapters of Frederick Douglass's autobiography, where as a kid he has to see his aunt raped, and hung up in the kitchen and raped, and the way you see it in the novels of Toni Morrison, the machines that were used to keep slaves' mouths open as punishment, and these were harnesses like like you would use on a horse, only they were metal. And the various, there were torture implements, in which were used. Presumably this was not life all the time, every hour, but it was something that lay like a kind of bottom line that was always there to intimidate people. Families were not sacred. There were no families, and you produced, when a woman produced children, she was producing, produce for her master that could be sold away, and this was a common part of the experience of being an African American, and this is the history that we grew out of. And as I said, at the same time, anything resembling a coherent society had been systematically squelched and systematically squashed. It wasn't a case of just being left alone. It was with malice aforethought, it was destroyed, because there was the definite feeling that if you treated people like this and you allowed them any kind of coherent society, they would rebel, which they did anyway. But without a coherent social fabric, the whites felt correctly that there was less chance of rebellion in that situation, and that's one of the reasons why things were done this way. The extent of that kind of violence is inconceivable. We can't conceive of it. We can just get momentary hints of it. It defies coherent human description. So that whatever happens has these, as I said, lines of violence that lead back to different historical moments. And the violence that's going to go back to is the one that historically, you grew up with, it, you learned about earliest. And these are so there are these roots of violence that such things resonate with, and they are different for different cultures. How they go to different kinds of incidents, and this is what these are the ones that were in my past. The same kind of confidence that I think I probably started developing at the hospital when I first started talking publicly about being gay, I think the entire gay community experienced with the Stonewall riots of June, that started on June 27th, 1969. It was the Stonewall Inn on Waverly Place was, when I first went there, probably sometime in 1968, was a black gay bar. And when I say it was a black gay bar, I was never there when at least 2/3 to 3/4 of the clientele were Hispanic and African American. It was traditional for the police regularly to raid gay bars, and they would arrest 2, 3, 5, 7 people whose names would be published in the newspaper the next day, who would immediately, by definition, would lose their job. Frequently, they'd be kicked out of the places where they lived, and then everybody else was sort of intimidated by this. Often there would be, 50, 75, 200 people in one of these places, but only
only a few would be arrested and sort of made scapegoats, and everybody else was therefore supposed to feel extremely grateful that they had been left off. And it was an intimidation process, and it was official. But what happened at Stonewall that night of June 27th, Judy Garland had just died, and people still wonder whether that didn't have something to do with it, because people were talking about her death that evening. When the police came in to raid Stonewall in this usual way, some of the drag queens who were there, particularly, said, "We're not going to take this anymore. No, we're not going to go with you peacefully." These raids were always usually carried out, like a sort of de rigueur thing. The policeman would walk in and say, you, and come on up, we're taking you in. And this time, people said, "No, you're not taking me in." Damned if I'm going with you. And the police just didn't know what to do, because nobody had ever acted that way on one of these raids before. And then when they decided, they were going to do it anyway, and they started to use physical force, other people jumped in and started fighting. Somebody threw a burning garbage can, at the police, and the next thing you know, there was a 3-day riot in Greenwich Village that went on and on and on, and people heard about the riot and began to drive in from New Jersey and from Connecticut cars were overturned. The Stonewall Inn itself was completely trashed, and the police were just stymied by this, because they'd never seen gay people stand up for themselves before. And within weeks of this happening, there was kind of a change throughout the gay community all over the country. People realized that we'd gone into a new moment. The 1968 had already been a year of great change, and 1969, that change was continuing. And I think Stonewall really brought that 18-month period of change that had really started with things like the King assassination in the beginning of April of '68, and the various legal changes and the student sit-ins at Columbia University and the uprisings that had gone on around that over in Europe had culminated in May '68. Stonewall was the last major change in that incredible period of transition. The immediate responses to Stonewall was simply that there was an actual formation of a gay liberation group, and the notion of coming out of the closet became the major political strategy. Up until that time, your biggest problem, if you were gay, was that you could be blackmailed. And somebody came up with something that I had thought many, many times before, and indeed it even sort of organized my life around and for several years at that point. But now it became a strategy that people were exhorted to do in things like the Village Voice and in other alternative press organs all over the country. If you tell everyone that you're gay, you can't be blackmailed. If you let people know that you are gay, the notion of being blackmailed becomes absurd. And what you have to do is, what gay people have to do is they have to let everyone know that they're gay, let people know how many of us there are, let people know what is going on. And as a political strategy, it was incredibly effective. It's changed the texture of gay life more than I think any actual change in laws that we've had, although the laws are very, very important. And one of the things that changed with Stonewall, because people came out, people began to have a sense of how many gay people there actually were. And I think that was the main change that happened. I
think I said at one other point before that people had the man on the street, l'homme moyen sensuel, assumed that there were maybe 1 out of 500 people was gay. Now people everywhere began to realize that that was not the case, and that you were dealing with 10 to 20% of the population. And because that had happened, that's the major thing, I think, that changed people's sense of that. And it also changed the sense of that gay people, that those of us who were gay had of ourselves, that we were not so isolated, that we were not alone, that we were part of a group, and that there, the notion that politicians could talk about the gay vote, or marketers could talk about the gay clientele or the gay consumers. This would have been unthinkable in 1967, even 1968. But once on the other side of Stonewall, it became immediately a reality. There is, of course, a whole gay slang that's associated with, the kind. At one point, it was a private language that gay men would use with one another. Now, really, since the '60s, it's been made a kind of public language. All that started when Susan Sontag published her essay "Notes on Camp" in the Partisan Review back in 1964. Coming out, of course, was taken from debutante cotillions, where 16-year-old girls would come out into society. And you came out into society, you were squired by, nervous cousins or friends of the family down the aisle, and the 16-year-old girl would come out socially. Well, this term had been taken over, and initially what it meant is having your first major gay sexual experience. Other terms, camping itself, which initially referred to camp followers. It's a term that goes back to World War I. The camp followers, or in fact it goes back to even further than that, it goes back to the 19th century. And camp followers were the prostitutes that followed the armies from city to city to city. And apparently the arrival of a whole bunch of soldiers was frequently an occasion for the young men who were in the town who were given to cross-dressing to go and flirt with the soldiers in drag. And so they were known as camp followers too. And so dressing up in drag was the original meaning of to camp, was basically for a man to put on woman's clothing and to camp it up. Drag comes from you put on a long gown and your train or the hem of your 19th century ball gown drags behind you. And so you're dressing up in drag is to dress up in something that that is so voluminous around your legs that it drags behind you on the ground. And the associations are that on the one hand it may be fun, but it's also a drag, because it also holds you back in some particular way. And to have this problem is to be, again, to have this problem, the fact that, that you are, encumbered in something that drags behind you. And there were, and then there was a whole set of terms for people with various sexual tastes. Toe queens, those are people who like messing around with other people's feet. There were drag queens who liked dressing up in the clothing of the opposite sex. Speed queens, the term taken from a popular brand of dishwasher, but also meant gay men who were addicted to amphetamines, or speed as it was known. Closet queens, and closet queens were people who really got a charge out of the fact that they were doing it and nobody knew. They liked to do it in the closet. Now, on the one hand, all of these terms were pejorative. Because being gay was considered a bad thing. So any further refinement of what it is you liked, was even more pejorative. Chicken queens, guys who like particularly young kids. There are any number of dozens of others. And I think the sex life of people over 60 is a great mystery to most people. I went to the movies yesterday with my daughter, and I came back from the restroom, and one of the things I was telling her about, she thought this was a hoot. My 29-year-old daughter cracked up in the middle of the theater. I said that there's a problem we older guys have, and that is our scrotums tend to lengthen. And so that now whenever I sit down on a public john, if the water level is too high, my balls hang in the water. She thought this was a hoot. I think it is a hoot, but it's a real problem. I said, you ought to know about this because someday your old man or your boyfriend or your husband may pass 60 and have the same problem, and you're going to be a doctor, so you should probably be able to say, yes, I'm familiar with this in the past. And she laughed and loud as how that was so. But there are all sorts of things about the realities of the body changing. The body changes just as much between the ages of 50 and 60 as it does between the ages of 10 and 20. Although there's a great deal written about the changes between 10 and 20, there are not so many changes written about the changes not so much written about the changes that goes through between 30 and 40, 40 and 50, 50 and 60, and presumably 60 and 70. Those you got to find out about yourself. And I think, but I think these are interesting topics. A lot of the public sex that I describe in The Motion of Light and Water, and in Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, those are things from my past, and they're things from my past for a whole number of reasons. The trucks simply don't exist anymore, or at least they don't exist where I can get to them, simply because the highway that they parked under has been torn down, and it's now a park over by the river, and there aren't any trucks there anymore. By the same token, Mayor Giuliani closed down all the porn theaters that promoted public sex. There's at least one in Philadelphia that's quite nice, and I find it a lot of fun to visit, and I do relatively well there. That's kind of, being on my side of 60, that is to say, what for me is the near side of 60, although for a lot of people it's the underside of 60, things work out in a different way. One of my students wrote a story in which an old man died, and the youngish 30-ish narrator goes in and described his shriveled testicles, and I had to take him aside and say, no, when you get older, your testicles get larger, they don't get smaller. He was surprised to hear that. There are a lot of things that a lot of people just don't know about what happens to the body. Old guys' testicles blow up. Not necessarily hugely, but enough to, so that when one starts talking about shriveled testicles, you realize the person probably doesn't know what they're talking about. On what is now my side of 60, things just work a little differently. What kind of places have I had sex in? I think a more reasonable question might be, what kind of places have I not had sex in? I've had sex in men's rooms, movie theaters, the orchestras, the back balconies, the bathrooms, dark doorways, theater dressing rooms, bedrooms, back alleys, motel and hotel rooms, stairwells, cars, the backs of parked trucks, also in the cabs and the sleepers, and even in a ladies' room once, in a summer camp tent, beside a hiking trail in the woods, in a sleeping bag, in country maintenance shacks, in shower stalls, in bathtubs, in cars driving down the thruway, in living rooms, in mobile homes, on apartment house roofs, in a pickup driving along a backcountry road, on a shrimp boat, on a Mediterranean ferry, in department store bathrooms, barn lofts, attics, kitchens, photographic dark rooms, public baths, restaurant back rooms, garages, an industrial hangar, restaurant kitchens, bridge walkways, peep show booths, sex bar gropes rooms, in a Paris pissoir, in a Venetian stone restroom at the end of the Ponte Accademia, in a urinal on the way up to the Acropolis, in grocery store storerooms, at truck stops, and by highways in the bushes, in public parks and playground restrooms, on subway cars, in public buses, city and intercity, in a phone repair truck, in phone booths in an Amtrak sleeper, Oddly enough, never on a plane, though once in an airport restroom, in at least one church balcony, and at night in a construction sites, both in this country and in England. Once I figured it out that, conservatively, I've probably been to bed with some 8 women, one, my wife, many, many hundreds of times over 13 years, and about 50,000 guys. The trucks themselves were not represented. They were a very different kind of social milieu from bar sex or any kind of sex in which that took place within the precincts of a more organized sense of society. People went in there wanting to have sex now. So you went in, you unzipped your pants, you took your dick, your testicles out, if that was your thing, and you got a blowjob or you blew someone else, and then you went and did it again if you wanted to, and you could easily have sex in 20, 30 minutes with 3, 5, 15 people, whether you did it to orgasm or not. That depended on how much you were enjoying it. And usually an orgasm was the end of things for at least 20 or 30 minutes, but not necessarily. It was an orgy, and indeed in some nights, on some warm summer nights, it was much more of an orgy than it was on cold winter nights. Although again, it could be that on cold winter nights too. To try and give a picture of it in a single cross section is impossible because it was so many different kinds of sex at so many different levels of saturation, at so many different levels and forms, and some nights were really good, some nights were a pain in the ass, some nights were not too good, and it could be anywhere in between. By and large, I thought of it as a very positive thing, a thing that made, for me, who am something of a workaholic, it meant that I could reward myself for a full day's writing work, in an hour or half an hour. There was not only the trucks, but there were also the various walkways of the various bridges. The Williamsburg Bridge, for me, that was my local spot. But at various other times, the Brooklyn Bridge, not quite so much. In fact, I don't think I ever personally had sex on the Brooklyn Bridge, although I gather there were times in the history of the city when that's the way things occurred. And I would imagine the Manhattan Bridge was not too different. In my imagination, I would take a camera into places like this all the time, and I was constantly trying to imagine what it would be like to film this, and film it in such a way that one was honest about it, that one was really showing not only what happened on a sexual level, but also the social mechanics that went along with it, because that most people think of this kind of activity is wild and Dionysian or Dionysiac and without controls, and public sex is probably some of the most socially rigidified behavior that human beings can get involved in. It's not. It has its Dionysiac side, but there's a whole order of politeness. You don't you don't take people away from other people, or if you do, you're really frowned on. You will not do too well if you become known as somebody who's constantly trying to move in on other people's pleasure. You have to learn how to accept no and rejection. As I've said in Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, the no's are nowhere near as catastrophic as they would be if, say, you went into a bar and spent 2 hours trying to pick somebody up and was eventually told to go away, because there are so many more people saying yes. You can go and get through your 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 rejections, and then find somebody who says yes, go through 3 more rejections, and find again someone who says yes, and again you can have sex with 2, 3, 5, 6, 7 people, even though a whole lot more people have said no to you. And that's, I think, that's real important. And it makes rejection a much easier thing to take if you realize there are a lot of people who like you. There are large elements of class. There are large elements that come into this. There are large elements of race. Even in a situation that would initially seem awfully democratic, there's a great deal of anxiety still produced by certain class deployments, and certain racial deployments. People get kind of antsy. You learn to negotiate these, certainly, and you learn to negotiate them. I think you do better if you learn to negotiate them, certainly. It's not racialist, it's not classless, it's not raceless. It's also ageist. I mean, the fact something like whether you have glasses on or not has a demonstrable effect on how you do, but. It's not so much that you don't do, if you have glasses on, you don't make out at all. You make out maybe, you have maybe 2/3 of the amount of encounters you would have if you didn't. So you make up your mind. Do I want to go around blind or wear contact lenses, as the case may be, or do I not? And some days you might take your glasses off and put them in your pocket, and some days you might go with your glasses, depending on what your own level of endurance for rejection was at that particular time. And also things like the number of people who are your regulars, people who you know, because one of the things that becomes more and more important as you get older is you do develop a circle of people that you see again and again and again, who basically like you, and whom immediately they really get into you. So it's very interesting to see the process by which the 25 to 35-year-old who is having sex with lots and lots of strangers metamorphoses into the 45 to 65 who is having sex with a circle of 10, 15, 20 regulars, that they know fairly well. When AIDS sort of first became, lifted its ugly head, as it were, in the beginning of the 80s, there was certainly a kind of an initial reduction in the amount of cruising that was going on, but by the same token, the people who were still left and who were doing the cruising were a lot more serious about it than the people, than the general level of seriousness before. So you had less to choose from, but the people who were there were, my sense was that they were a lot more interested in getting something, getting it on. So it had both its upside and its downside. It changed the flavor of a lot of things, the feel, the affect of the whole experience, but it certainly by no means did it stop it. The etiquette of public sex is a really complicated, although easily learnable situation. The places where one goes, most people are not interested in going to bathrooms where nobody has public sex, So you're much more likely to go to a bathroom where most of the people, or many of the people, or at least at certain times of the day, are in there to have sex with someone else. The idea is not to scandalize, fathers walking in with their 6-year-old kids, et cetera, sons or things like that. So that, again, when somebody, rarely have I not seen all activity come to a halt when somebody walks in with a child. There's a general sense that you're not there to, to educate those under 12, or even under 15. In public situations, when men have sex with one another, I think it's pretty much dependent on what kind of situation you're in. How much time is available, whether it is light or dark, whether you're in a situation where there are a lot of other men who are also having sex around you. how secretive your own temperament is. I don't think it can be really described too much more specifically than that, because there are so many factors that get involved. In my case, it was often oral sex, sometimes passive, sometimes active. Many people have anal sex in situations like that, sometimes active, sometimes passive. It's so generalized, there's pretty much nothing that two people can do together that somebody doesn't decide to do in one of those situations in some men's room, or in some behind the trucks, when there were trucks parked at the end of Christopher Street, or when two people get together. Personally, if I go into let's say a men's room for public sex, and it's one where I've been successful before, and it's one that's set up for that sort of thing, 9 times out of 10, my sex consists of mutual masturbation with somebody in the urinal next to me. He is looking at me and I'm looking at him, and this is quite satisfactory as far as I'm concerned. Occasionally, it'll, if there's nobody else there, or if it's easy, or if the other people who are there are obviously not averse to it, I'll fillet them, or fillet the other person, or be filleted. Other people will do many, many other things. There's nothing that you can't think of that somebody sometime hasn't done. New York is now a city without public bathrooms. It used to be a city where there were public bathrooms every 5-10 blocks. There are no subway bathrooms available to people in the subway, which is a crime. I mean, which is a crime, I think. One of the things that one does in a bathroom is go to the bathroom, and I think this is a necessary thing for people to do. Back in the 80s, when most of them were closed, in the early 80s, when all the public bathrooms were closed, somebody had this notion that because so much cruising went on in public bathrooms, by closing them, they were going to do something about the AIDS situation, which is just lunatic. They've closed all these down and made the city, among other places, a barbaric place where there's no place to relieve yourself.
Who is they?
They is the city fathers, the people who make such decisions about public facilities and things like that. The reason they've closed them is it's because it's cheaper. And they can save a minuscule amount of money by having these places closed. But the excuse is that it has something to do with AIDS and or family values, both of which are big smokescreens. What were some of the great bathrooms of my sexual history? I don't know. For one thing, they tend to be great only for relatively limited, even at the best of times. They tend to be, really active for only a small period of time, 2 or 3 months, and the activity will center there for a while, and you'll have some pretty wild times, and then either because of police intervention or what have you, it fades away. I can remember the Second Avenue, the Second Avenue subway at the D&F train, when the D&F train went through Second Avenue. I think don't think either the bathroom has been closed for many years, and the F train no longer goes through that stop. But I can remember some wonderful encounters there. The Tompkins Square. John used to be quite extraordinary. That's been closed up for many years. And what others? The second floor Port Authority, John, before they literally closed up one entrance on one side of the building. The John had 2 entrances, one on one side of a wall, and then there was a corner, and then it had another one on the other side of the wall, so that you could go in one and go out the other. And this made it a particularly what would you call it? The architecture made it particularly accessible for entering and leaving without being seen. The people who would see you, so you didn't have a sense of somebody could stand outside and say and watch and time how long you'd been in there. And then they closed up one of the entrances, and before when both entrances was open, it was quite again there were periods when it was quite extraordinary. I can remember some amazing people I met there.
Some of whom are like.
Well, they were amazing simply because they looked so good and acted so good and were so friendly and friendly here is a euphemism, for sexually active. The police were always in and out of these places. I used to wonder what the police actually thought they were doing. Some really were under the impression they were doing something they were making the world a better place. Those are the people who didn't stay on that detail too terribly long. There were others who very quickly developed a kind of, what would you call it, a kind of rapport with the sexual traffic, and that they pretty much saw their job as not to end it or stamp it out entirely, but rather to keep it under control, just to make sure it didn't get out of hand. And some of them could be quite friendly, Some of them, the policeman would wave to you on your way in, because they'd seen you there 12 times in the last week, and some of them didn't, and some of them were very condescending towards that, and some of them were, the policemen covered in their attitudes covered as large a range as the people using it, quite honestly. And again, the people using it could be people who were, on their way from work to home and had 5 minutes to run in and see if they could get something and were terrified if anybody would find out. And there were other guys who basically lived there would be there for 6 and 7 hours a day. Leaving every 45 minutes to do something else for 5 minutes and then coming back, and it could be anywhere in between, and we're not talking about hustlers. We're talking about people who were just availing themselves of, dare I call it, a public service. Well, I was never a judge in the Mr. Leather contest, but I was a judge one year for the Mr. Bear contest. That's B-E-A-R. And there are all sorts of bears. There are older bears are known as polar bears. There are black bears, and there are brown bears and grizzly bears. And there are Asian bears known as pandas. And there are all sorts of bears. It's a subgroup of the gay community.
What kind of bear are you?
I'm a brown bear. Letting people know that I'm black, that I'm gay, the kinds of things that are sort of shorthand signs for rather complex bits of history that extend, back before your family, is a really complicated topic, because on the one hand, I see myself involved in an enterprise in which that is supposed to matter less, or at least matter in a different way from the way that all too often that it does. But at the same time, it's not something that it's something I'm proud of. It's something that I think is a good thing. It has made me who I am, and I think, and it's something that I want to celebrate. So that it's always, you never know quite what you're doing when you do it. I don't go around thinking about it all the time. I don't think anybody does. I don't think people go around thinking, oh, oh, I belong to this group or I belong to that group 24 hours a day. I think that way lies, paranoid madness. At the same time, it is something that you want to celebrate. It's something that is an integral part of who you are. So each decision to say something about it is precisely that. It's a decision. Is this the appropriate time, or is this not the appropriate time? And one of the things I'm always asking myself is my desire not to say it at this particular time a matter of fear, a matter of I'm going to offend somebody? Those are the times I think you have to be brave and actually say it. And that old-fashioned value, bravery, I think is an important one. I wonder if you can talk about bravery in the same way in terms of writing when, for instance, you write about sexuality explicitly, or when, indeed, you write about race explicitly, or gender explicitly, or whatever of those. Or the amount of money you make explicitly. Any of those difficult topics in American discourse. To go against what is expected always produces some anxiety. And again, I think most people realize that if we want to make a better world, we are going to have to go against what is expected, and we are going to have to articulate things that may produce a bit of anxiety, and it behooves us to articulate them in a tone of voice that tries to allay some of that anxiety. In the actual writing, I don't feel it takes bravery. Indeed, when writing is much more like talking to yourself. And it's part of the imaginative process where you can let things go. In fact, one of the nice things about writing is that it doesn't evoke the same kinds of anxieties that actually talking in a face-to-face situation may evoke. I'm happy aligning myself with other black gay men, other people who that's the category that history has assigned them to. I know, that if I'm walking down the street and behind me somebody yells out, you nigger cocksucker, they're talking to me, and I turn around, because I think I would prefer to get it in the front, than take it in the back. I think that language is a tool for talking. I don't think words ever define anybody, any human being entirely. They are useful for provisional situations. I can talk about this person over here and say, you are a writer. I can say you are someone who has studied art for 12 years at the Art Students League. I can say, you are a woman who has 2 children. These may all be referring to the same person, and depending on what we need to talk about at a particular given time, none of these sets of words completely limit the person I'm talking about, nor do all of them completely limit the person I'm talking about. What we have to acknowledge is there is a given context in which we're talking, and we use these words because they're useful to the context. They're provisionally useful, and that they're descriptive power. I don't even believe there are such things as definitions. I think people who try to define things are fooling themselves. And half of my answers to questions like this are a part of a project of pointing out how the whole definitional project, which is largely exclusionary, is a false project when you are dealing with really complex social human objects, genres, art, things of that sort, and people. I am severely dyslexic. Now, when I was a kid, the word dyslexia wasn't even known, and people used to wonder, especially when my teachers in school, how I could be this kid with 169 IQ who couldn't spell the word apple correctly 3 times in a row, and they wondered what in the world was causing me to, do this. And I was sent to psychiatrists and counselors, and they assumed people came up with every theory they could. This was attention-getting behavior. I was deeply disturbed, and eventually I just, learned to live with it. When I was 21, had been married for 3 years, my wife found an article about dyslexia, and all of the symptoms that it talked about, I showed. And we realized that that's what it was, and not that it, one could do very much about it, although the people used to suggest all sorts of things back at that time, crawling around on the floor because it was assumed you couldn't correlate your left hand and your right leg and things like this, and so there were all sorts of things that they gave you to do, none of which helped very much. But nevertheless, it was interesting to have a word for it finally. If it has or hasn't impacted my writing, it's very, very hard to tell. Lots of writers were dyslexic. F. Scott Fitzgerald, Virginia Woolf, William Butler Yeats, and of course the most famous of them, Gustave Flaubert, who was known because of the same symptoms as the idiot of the family, even though he was obviously a brilliant person. Finally, there's not much I can really say about it. I think it makes me, I have to rewrite things again and again to get correct the things that the lucky lexic in our society cavalierly call the mechanics. And so I have to rewrite things, many times in order to get those right. And so while I'm at it, I'm happy to, to elide the odd adjective, apocopaate some terminal prepositional phrase, and generally try to polish the style as much as I possibly can. So in that sense, maybe the dyslexia is a kind of goad to making things a little better. How it affected my reading, that's another question entirely. I don't think it did. I read omnivorously, and I read slowly. I still do read slowly. I'm practically one of those people who moves their lips when they read still to this day. And yet I was a person who, at the same time, I remember when I was 13, I stayed up for 36 hours in succession reading all of War and Peace, as a kind of ordeal for myself. But I finished it. I always liked what guys with beards looked like. They looked cool to me, and so I wanted to have one too. But I always wanted a big, long, belly button duster, and a sort of Whitman-esque or George Bernard Shaw type style beard. And at one point, I suddenly realized you're not going to have that if you cut it off every summer. So I just about 20 years ago, I guess, I just decided to let it grow, and discovered, as many people do, that my beard only gets so long. It is now as long as it gets. After that, it just breaks off and vanishes away. So it never is going to get down to the place where I would like it. As far as I'd be concerned, I'd be happy if it went down to my knees, but it doesn't. So this is what I've been dealt. This is what I got. Once every 40 minutes during the summer time and spring and autumn, and during the winter, once every 45 seconds, someone will say, "Oh, hey, Santa Claus." I mean, I hear this regularly, and everybody thinks it's the first time it's ever been said. And I don't mind it. Santa Claus I think of as a positive image in the society, so I don't really mind it. at least one point when I was walking down the streets of Ann Arbor, Michigan, when I was a senior fellow at the Society for the Humanities, a bunch of Arab kids in a car yelled out the women, "Hey, you fucking Jew!" You know, that's the other thing that goes along with it. So I've been called all sorts of things, you know, because of the beard. And you live with them. My response to being called a fucking Jew was immediately go to the local Arab restaurant and sit there and you know, and eat my falafel and, you know, and what have you, and just sort of be there as a presence. I'm not Jewish. I'm this black Episcopalian, you know, but nevertheless, I think things like this need to be done. I suppose I probably wouldn't wear it if I felt that people, even the ones who call out every 20 minutes, "Hey, Santa Claus," was some kind of imposition. There must be some part of me that likes being an object of interest. I'm something of a ham, and so that's, you know, that's there, and so all of this goes into the mix, and you know, so it's part of, you know, it's part of who I am. Harlem in the 20s, of course, was a very lively place. It was, you know, it was jazz age Harlem. You know, it was the Harlem Renaissance time, and my father played the cornet, and for a couple of weeks he played with Cab Calloway's band at the Cotton Club, but, you know, only for a couple of weeks. And I remember my mom, who was born in New York, she was a black woman born in New York, she had a friend named Winnie Mason who lived in Brooklyn, and Winnie was where the 15-year-old Lena Horne was sort of brought up here to perform at the Cotton Club, when she was indeed too young to go into the Cotton Club, and Lena stayed with Winnie, and my mother, you know, would go out there, and you know, they were all 15 and 16-year-old girls, and but it was rather glamorous having this one 15-year-old girl who was singing, you know, in Harlem, at the time, you know, but. So it was an interesting time, you know. I think they had fun. My parents eventually were fairly good friends with the Callaways, and Cab's birthday was at Christmas time, and they would all, my father and my mother and Cab and his wife Lady Constance, which was what her nickname was, would all go to a hockey game on Christmas, and then they would. Go up to Cab's place, and I think it was New Rochelle or Mount Vernon, I'm not sure which, someplace just above the city, and Cab had set up his basement to look like the inside of the Cotton Club. And of course, black people were not allowed in the Cotton Club as audience. So the only way, if you were black, the only way you learned what the Cotton Club looked like is if you got to one of Cab Calloway's birthday/Christmas parties, but which they used to go to, you know. This is all before I was born in the 30s. You know, I didn't come along till 42. The part of New York I grew up in was Harlem. I was born in Harlem Hospital, right on 138th Street and Lenox Avenue. And when I was a kid, Harlem was, it was loud, it was smelly, and there were lots and lots of people in it. I lived a block north of what I believe the 1950 census was the most crowded block in New York City. There were 10,000 people living in one square block, which probably means that block beat out Calcutta and you know, and the most crowded parts of, you know, Peking and all sorts of places that we think of as inhumanly you know, populated. Eventually that block was torn down. It was replaced by the St. Nicholas Housing Project, which held probably less than a fifth of the same number of people who lived in that space beforehand. That's how the city back then dealt with overpopulation. It simply made fewer houses for people to live in, and you tell me what the logic is, but that's how it was done. But because of that population, that was another place where people met a lot and interacted, you know, and things went on.
I think overwork was a lot of it. I really think overwork was a lot of it. I'm severely dyslexic, so getting these manuscripts in shape so that you could send them to a publisher was a lot of work for me. As I said, it was a lot of typing and retyping, and it was yeah. I think the pressure also of trying to function as a heterosexual, you know, having sex twice a week with my wife, you know, which I felt was kind of a duty. And the same when you didn't, it wasn't your natural bent, and you didn't get the kind of you didn't take from it the emotional support that I gather most heterosexuals do from heterosexual sex. A support that I feel very much from, you know, from when I have sex with a man, or have had like with Dennis, or my partner of the last 15 years. I do feel that support and that safety, and that maybe if I had been in a situation like that where where I got that, there might have been less pressure. But in a situation where the sex leaves you basically feeling kind of empty and not, not there, you know, like something is really missing from it, which is the way most heterosexual sex has been for me. When Marilyn and I had gotten married, Marilyn knew I was gay. I made a big point once we decided we were going to get married to remind her, and she said, you know, of course I know, you've taken me cruising with you for God's sakes. You know, it was very much something that we were both, you know, aware of. What we didn't know is what it would mean. You know, we didn't know, we knew, we were kids, you know, she was 18, I was 19. We were children, we were very bright children. She was a particularly bright 18-year-old. She was a brilliant 18-year-old. She'd gone to college when she was 15 and graduated when she was 18. But in terms of what it would mean in terms of just the emotional development, no, I don't think we had a clear picture of that. We were very good friends. We were extremely good friends, and she was my confidant, and I was a great support to her. But it was not, we weren't roommates. We were trying to live as man and wife, and it was not really working, you know. In the group, when I first started talking about this, you know, doing my confession to the vinyl tile on the floor of the room, I remember I'd mentioned there was this one other guy in the group an older man, older, it seemed to me at the time he was probably about 33 or 34, who used to wear very fluffy purple sweaters, who himself was almost certainly gay. And I remember he obviously was feeling something for me in the midst of all this confession. And he said, well, maybe, Chip, this is just something that you're going through. It's something that you're going to go, you know, grow out of. Again, you have to remember this is 1964 when people said this. And I remember I said to him, well, it's not something I want to grow out of. It's something, you know, that it seems to be part of me. All of the kinds of things that one does in, you know, as a sexually active gay young man, the actual cruising that you do in bathrooms on the Williamsburg Bridge, in my case, all around, you do, but you don't talk about. You don't talk about it with anybody. You don't. It doesn't work its way into any kind of social interchange, and you talk about it sometimes, or you talked about it at that time, sometimes with other gay people whom you were actually doing it with, but not even very much. Not even a lot of that went on, or at least not in my experience back then. So that to sit in front in an institution with tiles on the walls like these, and and to sit around in a circle, of people whom you know in some respects, but you don't know them that well, and say, hey, I'm gay. And you didn't have the word gay. You had the word homosexual, which was considered a disease, you know, and it was something halfway between a disease and a crime. And indeed, it was a crime. It was something you'd be arrested for, you know. So to come out with that in an articulate way was hard. It was very, very hard. But you need something more, not just to be able to talk about it, but be able to say something about it that's actually relevant and that cleaves in some way to the truth. And whatever the truth is, it wasn't covered by confession, by a simple confession of, oh, I've got this problem.
The nebula boards, time consistent.
This is what having different tests.
Cheap and what have you, trying to get the food. Daniel is.
No?
I'd love it.
No.
Well,
You parted with them because you were tired of there, or?
no, because I was hired away by another.
Well, in the early 70s, Denny O'Neil at DC Comics asked whether I'd be interested in writing Wonder Woman. And I thought that was a great thing to do. For one thing, comic books have an extraordinary audience. DC was in the midst of doing something that they called relevant comics, and these had been getting quite a bit of attention. There'd even been a New York Times a magazine article devoted to them that was a cover article in the Sunday Times magazine. So I was very happy to do it. I came up with a story arc of 6 stories, in each one of which Wonder Woman had a different male villain that she had to deal with. One was a department store manager. The other one was a supermarket
owner of a chain of supermarkets who was trying to undercut a woman's food cooperative. And this worked all the way through until the last one. She had to defend an abortion clinic. Some pretty interesting stuff to deal with in comics, I thought. Unfortunately, at the same time, Wonder Woman at that point had given up her American flag brassiere and her bullets and bracelets, and was going around in a sort of white gi, and had been for several years. But one afternoon when Gloria Steinem, who was then, I believe, the editor-in-chief of Ms. Magazine, was being taken through the D.C. offices, they showed her very proudly the new Wonder Woman, and her response was, "But what happened to her? What happened to her costume? What happened to all her magic powers?" She then gave a little talk about how important these had been for girls all over the place, which, of course, was very true. The only problem is if you gave her back all her magic powers, there was no way she could have dealt with the plots that I had set up for her to deal with, because you'd have the Superman problem. That is to say, there was no conflict if she had all these magic powers again. This directive came down from the halls of power in D.C., basically saying put Wonder Woman back in her American flag, falsies and her bikini. Gloria Steinem has spoken, and we had to ditch the story arc, and so she never got to fight for the. And I couldn't work my stories around that. So although I'd done 2 issues of the series of 6, we had to stop it in the middle, and so she never got to fight for an abortion clinic.
I'm Samuel R. Delany, and I'm a writer. For me, that means someone who creates dramatic fictions, a series of dramatic fictions. For me, a writer is also somebody who's an intellectual, which means I do a lot of different kinds of writing. When I started writing fiction back in 1960, when I was 20, when I started publishing it, I first started writing science fiction. That's what I did, I guess, for the first, 7 or 8 years of my life. Then I decided to write something a little bit more ambitious, and I spent about 5 years working on a novel called Dhalgren, which is still a science fiction novel, but it has resonances that fall out of science fiction as well. It could easily be thought of as a kind of American magic realism, I suppose. Moving among the various genres as I do, people always ask me, well, why did you change from one to the other? And that's always very hard for me to answer. You write different kinds of things because there are different kinds of things to write. There's no particular, I move back and forth between them. After I wrote Dahlgren, which, as I said, is set in more or less times relatively contemporary to the writing, all those strange and fantastic things happen in it. I went back and wrote another novel set in the far future called Triton. From then on, I went and moved on to a series of sword and sorcery novels, that is to say, novels set in the distant past at the start of civilization. The whole series is called Return to Nevarian, and it consists of 11 stories, novels, short novels, one fairly long novel of almost 450 pages, that sort of explores the concept of civilized origins, what happens, what causes things to begin, what kinds of things, what forces make the things that we recognize as civilization and civilized action start. For which Trouble on Triton really is the preface. If you read them carefully, you'll find out that all of them bear the subtitle Informal Remarks Towards the Modular Calculus, which is the fancy name for the whole series, with Trouble on Triton as the preface. And then after that, I moved on to very different things. Novels like The Madman, Atlantis, which is a short, very short novel that's a kind of historical novel and has no fantastic elements in it whatsoever. It has a lot of linguistic play, which has a fantastic side to it. Then most recently, a little novella called Phallos. And those more or less are cover the fiction. In the same time, there's been a lot of nonfiction as well. A good 12 or 13 volumes of nonfiction have been interspersed with those. And that's really a kind of nutshell view of the whole writing career. Nova was one of my science fiction novels, really the last of the science fiction novels before Dahlgren. It's probably I think of it as the most ambitious of the science fiction novels. It's all about the ways art and labor and politics interconnect. And it tries to paint a fairly rich picture of an entire society, and a society in which there are some major political conflicts going on. It talks about, at one point, the characters talk about the three P's: physics, psychology, and politics. And of course, one of the ironies there is that most people, when they just hear physics, psychology, and politics, they're only aware of one of them really begins with P. But of course, physics and psychology begin with P as well, which is to sort of, I guess, the fact that their relationship at the level of the letter is kind of mystified and hidden, which is one of the things that the book itself is about. A nova is a new star, and every once in a while in the sky, often a star that's almost too dim for us to actually perceive from the Earth, will suddenly flare up and become bright as 100 stars, 1,000 stars. Sometimes you even get a supernova, which is brighter still, and those only happen about once every 1,000 years. The novas themselves happen sometimes as much as 2 or 3 times a year. Sometimes you go for 3 whole years without finding one. But it's a new star, and basically when that happens, the star implodes and it releases a lot of energy at the same time. So it's a great explosion, and it produces a new stellar object in the sky. When I wrote Nova, it was at the time when we were just beginning to use atomic energy to create electricity, and there was a great deal of hope that atomic energy would be a new form of energy that would be highly useful, as it has turned out to be, for productive ways, not only as weapons. So I think really from the 30s on, people were interested in new forms of energy, and through the 50s and 60s, there was a lot of talk and thought about new energy sources, and this is reflected in Nova. Dhalgren, it was a very ambitious project for me. It took me about 5 or maybe even more than 5 years to write. It's a long book. I would write a sentence down at the top of a notebook page, and I would just do variations on that sentence till I got to the bottom of the page, and sometimes do more variations for several more pages. And when I got the sentence into the form I liked it, I would put it and mortar it into the text, and then I'd go and work on another sentence. And so there was a lot of, there was a lot of work to the actual texture of the writing. And that's how I write. I'm a very slow worker. I'm not a fast writer. And I do endless twiddling and revision and rewriting of each phrase and each sentence till it's close to what I want, and very often it never quite gets to what I'm totally satisfied with anyway. Freak phenomena, as far as I am concerned, Dahlgren is certainly my most popular novel. It's long. A lot of people find it very, very difficult. It was not a book that was easy to sell. It went to a number of publishers before it was bought. Doubleday called up to say that they bought it on Friday, and then Tuesday called up very embarrassed and said that they were unbuying it again because that it was just too long and too much for them. So no one was more surprised than I when it ended up selling very well. I had assumed that I would be lucky if it found a publisher at all. But Fred Pohl at Bantam Books took it over and bought it. I asked him how he managed to get it through, and he said by not telling anybody it was 900 pages long. He said basically they just published it, and then at the sales conference they presented this, what looked basically like a red brick, and said, you got to go out and sell this. And everybody was so surprised that they went out and they did sell it, and it went into a half dozen printings over the first year, much to everyone's surprise and a little bit of consternation. Literally no advertising money was put into the book at all because they were the sales came as a total surprise, so that they were always afraid that if they actually plumped out any money for actual advertising, the commercial crest would have been passed, and they would lose the advertising money. But over the next 12 years, it sold somewhat over 1 million copies. Nobody, could have been more astonished than I was. Most of the images of that sort of went into the book came from the burned-out center, inner cities. Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Cincinnati, Los Angeles, Harlem in New York. Harlem when I grew up in Harlem as a kid, it was this overcrowded, lively, congested area of the city. When my family left Harlem, just afterwards, maybe 1 out of 5 apartment buildings had anybody living in it at all, and the other 4 were just completely abandoned or boarded up. And I think people may have just recognized this image, and maybe they'd seen it around themselves. It wasn't just a New York problem. It was a problem in every major American city. I think people perhaps recognized it. So it became a book about the urban situation in America, or a book that took place in a recognizably urban situation, and one that was not being written about in other pieces of fiction. You'd read a lot of fiction from that, from the 70s, the late 60s, and you wouldn't know that that's what was happening. Shortly after that, when I had managed to get a contract for an early version of Dhalgren, and I went off to San Francisco. And while I was in San Francisco, I was having some problems moving on with Dhalgren. I started working on still another pornographic novel, this one called Hogg. And Hogg basically filled up 4 notebooks, just one after another. And then I put them in the back of a closet and came back to New York, finished Dahlgren, and Dahlgren was, was eventually started being shown around to publishers. And then I returned to San Francisco. And when I returned to San Francisco, the guy who had the house where we used to live in, Paul Caruso, said, "Well, oh, by the way, do you still want those notebooks you left in the closet?" And so I went back in the closet and discovered I had an entire novel that I had written and had literally forgotten existed. And that was kind of an interesting phenomenon. And so finally I took that and I typed it up, and that was a novel called Hogg. It didn't get published for another almost 20 years, and when it did, it's actually gotten a fairly interesting response from a number of people who find it an interesting book. The book was actually finished probably within 2 or 3 days, if not even less, maybe even a day, before the Stonewall riots in New York City while I was in San Francisco. And I remember sort of one of the things that drove it out of my mind was the excitement that people were feeling about the Stonewall riots in New York, in Greenwich Village, and what they meant for the entire gay liberation movement. One of the reasons it wasn't published for 20 years is that it's probably it's a very dirty book. That's the best way, I think, to describe it. It's full of all the things that people are always saying pornography is full of, but it never is. Which is to say, it's got lots of violence and terrible things happening to men, women, and children. It's not an easy book for a lot of readers, and I think that's one of the things that held off its publication.
Now, why did I start to write science fiction? I think it's primarily because I used to enjoy reading it, and it was lots of fun to read. And I also wrote a lot of other things at the same time. I would write novel after novel after novel as an adolescent. They weren't very good novels, but and I would send them around to publishers, and a couple of them got me the odd scholarship here or there. I had a waiter's scholarship to the Bread Loaf Writers Conference when I was about 18, and every once in a while, an editor would become somewhat interested in me. But somehow the non-science fiction never placed, and I got married at 19, and my wife was a very talented young poet named Marilyn Hacker, at the time, and she got a job working for Ace Books, which was a small company that had published William Burroughs' Junkie in the early 50s, and Carl Solomon of Howl fame, I'm With You in Rockland, Carl Solomon, worked there at Ace Books as an idea man, and Marilyn was working there as an editorial assistant, and so they published primarily science fiction, and she would come home complaining about the science fiction that she had to edit. So basically for her, I started writing a science fiction story, or science fiction novel that was sort of, that addressed all the problems that she had with the science fiction she was editing. And one of her main complaints was the women characters of the stories who tended to be limp princesses who got rescued, or on the other hand, they tended to be evil femme fatales who were so evil that you didn't believe them. So I tried to write a story that had women characters that were a little bit more believable, and the hero was a poet instead of the usual overbearing, spaceship captain. And one thing led to another, and she suggested that I submit it. So we did, under a pen name, Bruno Calabro. Where we got that, I will never know. I do know, actually. It was a name of a character in another novel I'd written. She took it in and put it on the top of the slush pile, and the editor-in-chief, Don Walheim, read it and decided he wanted to buy it. And so after the contracts were drawn up, and we were very moral children back then, we were not going to, use any, It was only after the contracts were drawn up that Marilyn said, "Oh, by the way, that's my husband." And Don said, "I'm very glad because I hate the name Bruno Calabro." So I went back to being Samuel Delany. And a few months later, it was published when I was 20. And that was my first sale of a novel, back in 1962, a long, long time ago. The science fiction writer and critic Damon Knight used to give a wonderfully humorous little ostensive definition of science fiction. Science fiction is what I point at when I say science fiction. There are lots of things you can say about much science fiction. Much science fiction takes place in the future. Much of it has rocket ships and ray guns. There are science fiction movies and science fiction television shows and science fiction books, and we've all read some. So it's no big mystery what it is. We all know what it is. How do you describe it? I describe it the same way you would. Beyond a certain point, I don't particularly care how you define or how anyone defines science fiction, because it's a done deal already. It's already, we already know what it is. So that we know what it is in the same way we know what poetry is, that we know what fiction is, we know what the novel is, we know what tragedy is, and we know what comedy is. One of the reasons that the academic interest in science fiction probably took a big leap in 1958 may well have been Sputnik's, the 1957 launching of Sputnik. One of the little facts that I've been always quite delighted by is that on a single newscast on, I believe it was a Saturday, we heard about Sputnik. We also heard about the protests against the school desegregation in Little Rock. They came on the same newscast. And on that Saturday morning, Malcolm Crowley had his review of Jack Kerouac's On the Road, which began the history of that novel, become the sort of the icon of the counterculture. Three things that happened literally on the same day. And a year later, at City College, Sam Moskowitz taught the first course in the first university level course that we know of in science fiction. The early science fiction that I wrote, or the science fiction that I wrote at the beginning of my career, for me leads pretty directly into the kinds of things that I'm doing now. I'm much more aware of the continuity between them than any kind of break between them. There is the self-evident genre break that before I used to write science fiction, then I moved on to writing sword and sorcery and the pornography or the work with a high pornographic element that I'm doing, and I don't mind calling it pornography, seems like a jump across genre. But many of the concerns, I think, are there in the early stuff. How people respond to the world, how people can see the world, and the kinds of work you do on the sentences. Again, that 20 hours of work for the 10 minutes of thinking is pretty much the same on both sides of the genre division. Again, and that it's that which connects them in my mind. The reason I bother to write in the first place is because I love all the things I do while I'm writing, many of which are very ordinary. I was with my daughter, who is now about 29, and this was a few years ago, and we were sitting about when she was 24, 25, and we were sitting around with some friends of, both of hers and mine, and for some reason they were asking me about my working habits, and I said quite honestly, well, I don't have a fixed schedule for working. I don't work I don't see myself as somebody who works every day, and I always see myself as someone who never gets enough done, at which point my daughter said, "My God, Dad, you work harder than anybody else I've ever known. That you're up at 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning," which I am. I was up at 5:30 this morning. I was up at 4 o'clock yesterday morning. And you work all day, and you don't stop working, and then you go to bed. At 9, at anywhere from 8:30 to 9:30, you go to bed, which is true. That's what my ordinary day is. A lot of writing actually doesn't require a great deal of thought, paradox though it may be, which is to say, getting ideas, working through first drafts. Yes, that requires an outlay of energy. But taking a sentence that you've written that's got a couple of extra adjectives in it, and the clauses are in the wrong order, and putting that in the right order is a relatively automatic process. You have to do lots of it. And for me, that's what most of my writing is. Most of my writing is just rearranging words that are already down, that I've already put down. And that doesn't require a lot of thought. It requires what it requires is lots of time. And I spend lots of time doing that, making the sentences better. I love taking a clumsy sentence and turning it into an elegant sentence. Whether it's my own sentence or somebody else's, whether I'm doing it in an email message for a friend, I like making the language stronger, which is what I guess I see myself doing. If those sentences aren't as clear and as elegant and as pristine and as forceful as they can possibly be, no one's going to read what you write. Nobody's certainly going to go back and reread it. No one's going to republish it. No one's going to reprint it in 5 or 10 or 15 years. And the vision is, it might have been there, but it's going to be so blurred that no one is going to ever get around to being able to appreciate it. Emily Dickinson said it, nothing survives without fine execution. And basically what you have to be in love with, above and beyond all things, is all those things that make the execution fine. I've been bizarrely lucky enough to have been granted a certain amount of ability to put some of this stuff down that I've seen down on paper. I don't know how that works. It's as mysterious to me as it is to anybody else. I don't even know if it does work. I can't read my own stuff, so that I don't know. I don't know in any absolute way whether it is actually functions or not, or whether somebody picking this stuff up gets any of the pulse and beat of what I'm actually talking about. Every once in a while, people come on like they do, and I'm very pleased and very grateful that it happens. But I, myself, am just not interesting. I really am not. I was lucky I was lucky enough to be at the intersection of a certain set of occurrences, and was able to, and some of them, a very, very few of them, I've been able to record. That's the way I really see it and feel it. Now, you want to say that's silly? You want to say that, something else is going on? It may be. I don't know what it is. And I'm not in touch with it. I wish I were. It would be interesting, Some writers, I think, really do go around seeing themselves as having something important to say. Somebody like D.H. Lawrence, whom I find that precisely to the extent that he did, a total bore. Do see themselves as really important creatures, in the world, and that they've got something that they want to put out there. Tolstoy was another one. I am not a Tolstoy. I am not a D.H. Lawrence. That's not the way I experience myself. I experience myself as the world's dullest guy. The intricate interpenetration of the senses, woven into that proto-historic textile, the tapestry of day, sleep and forgetfulness unravel as effectively as any Penelope. But it would be as naive to think that all forgettings are random as it would be to think thus of all dreams. One can be reworked into the other with astonishing rapidity, strength into weakness, weakness into strength. My working method is on something, let's say, like Atlantis Model 1924, which is a book that is
is like the tip of a kind of iceberg with miles and miles of research and about 3 years worth of research underneath this little 120-page novella. Is, you know, you write 2 words and then you go to the library for 3 hours and make 4 pages worth of notes in your notebook and come back and write 3 more words, and it goes on and on like this. It was one of the things I wanted to do is to see how many references and allusions and resonances with other texts I could cram into the book. There's so many I can't remember them all, and it was just like a big game, you know. Any dull, seamy season can throw up an Atlantis. Any dull, seamy season is an anagram for Samuel R. Delany, and there's that kind of, you know, puns and plays and word plays all through the thing. Yeah, I looked up the dates of the full moon, you know, in 1924, and so I know that the full moon in April was on August 14th, and although August 14th is not mentioned, there is a scene under the full moon in the middle of April. I read the weather reports for every day that the story, you know, the story dealt with. And it was just, you know, there are references to ephemeris and things like that in it, but I had them all, you know, on my desk and was checking them and out to make sure that all of this stuff was right. Each of the first little 4 paragraphs has 36 words in it. Each one, all the words in each one are borrowed from a different book. You know, the kind of thing that nobody could conceivably be interested in reading it, and the general reader isn't aware of unless they happen to be, you know, happen to have just read, you know, the passage that I took the words and rearranged them to make my own thing out of. But this is, you know, it's a big game, like a Go game, and the whole purpose of the game is to make all that stuff invisible, make it not, you know, it's there, but you don't want any of it to be seen, you know, and so that's, you know, that. It's an absolutely obsessive, very unpleasant experience when all is said and done. One part of it was to see what it felt like to write a work like that. It's the only work I ever did that was written that way, to sort of see what it would be like to do a work that did all the things that critics are always saying, let's say somebody like James Joyce does in Ulysses, to see what it would feel like to do it. Not for in terms of the result, but to see what it would feel like to be on the inside of the process. I did not like the feeling at all.
When I was going through Atlantis, which is the first of the sections from the bridge that Crane wrote, and the first sections were written directly when he moved into, the house there, in the, I guess it's the 7th stanza of Atlantis, the closing fragment, the first written of the poems in the series. There's this line that says, you know, Pacific here at time's end, bearing corn. This has got to be the same cornfields that my father had seen when he'd taken the walk across when he was 17. And basically from that realization, I got the idea of, you know, of writing a story that would focus on an imaginary meeting between my dad taking a walk across the Brooklyn Bridge, and where he runs into Hart Crane. And that was really the kernel of the whole novella. Crane himself was a lover of sailors. The love of his life was a sailor, Emil Opfer, and Opfer's father had been a sailor before him, and at one point, Emil Sr. had told the 2 boys, when Crane and Emil were living together, that when he had been a young sailor in the Danish Navy, at one point he had, just to see what would happen, he leapt overboard on his ship to see how long it would take his shipmates to rescue him. The only thing, of course, is he was on a windjammer, It wasn't didn't have a mechanical propeller. And the death of Hart Crane is always one of these great mysteries. On the one hand, he had a suicidal streak. Only a few days before, back in Mexico, he had made an attempt to drink some iodine. In fact, that's why he was being deported from the country. That was the government's response to his wildly inefficient suicide attempt, was to send him back to the United States. But the day before he committed suicide, he sent two delightful postcards to two people, that there wasn't a hint of depression or anything else. But that same day was the day that was Emile's birthday, and Emile and Hart had not been together for a couple of years at that particular point. And April 17th may just have been, because it was Emile's birthday, and Hart was a hopeless alcoholic. By that evening, he was absolutely sloshed. And we know he went down to the sailors' quarters. He may have tried to read some of his poems to the sailors. He may have tried to put the make on one of the sailors, but the next morning he had a black eye. His watch had been stolen. His wallet was empty. And he was traveling with Peggy Cowley, Malcolm Cowley's soon-to-be divorced wife, and they were planning, or at least Hart was under the impression they were planning to get married. Peggy herself said later that she had no intention of marrying him. She was just kind of humoring him because he was in a strange state, and she was as much of a drinker as he was. But at any rate, at around 12 noon, when the passengers were gathered to receive the results of the ship's pool that was announced at noon every day, Hart, who had been in to see Peggy and said something, he was in his pajamas and he had his top coat on for a bathrobe over it, and he said, "I'm not going to make it, darling." And she didn't realize quite how depressed he was, and said, "Go put your clothes on, dear. You'll feel better when you get washed or something, or get yourself together." And so he walked out on the back of the deck where the ship's passengers were gathered to hear the results of the daily pool, in his top coat, and he walked to the back rail of the ship, the steamship Orizaba. He took his coat off, he folded it up, he hung it over the rail, and he held onto the rail, he leaned back, and then he vaulted over into the water. He vaulted over the back of the ship, right where the propeller was. Was it just a desperate call for help, kind of like Emile Sr.'s, to see how long they were going to rescue him? One of the tourists, one of the passengers, Gertrude Berg, ran to the back, and she remembers seeing him swimming fairly strongly. But then there was a wave or something, and he disappeared from sight, and nobody ever saw him again. They never found the body. The assumption was that he was pulled under by the undertow of the propeller. He was a real nuisance. I mean, he had been making a real nuisance of himself on board. They'd locked him in his cabin once because he was so drunk that he was disturbing the other passengers. And there he was, 32 years old, and that was the end of Hart Crane.